Good morning, good evening, wherever you are. Welcome back to the Enterprise AI Show. I'm your host, Brian Gracely. And today what I want to try and do, instead of maybe doing some of the things we've done in the past in terms of, weekend perspectives or interviews with, founders and leaders and so forth, is really kind of dive into some, what am I going to do with this information, right? I think we spent a lot of time on this show, both over the last year or so, but, in the past, kind of trying to educate people and identify new things that were out there, trying to identify and educate them about, trends that were happening. And we'll still do that on things like AI News of the Month and so forth. But I feel like, in this point in time, especially with something new, and it's been a while since we've had something truly new like this with AI, oftentimes the thing that you're looking for is not so much education on what's new, but really, what do I do with that? How can I go deal with that? And so I want to dig into, I have this list that I've been working on. I call it my top 10 enterprise AI questions, or top 10 enterprise AI kind of challenges that people have right now. And I want to kind of dig into that in a series of shows. We're going to start with this one. We're really going to kind of dig into the idea of token economics. And more importantly, is the sort of price that you're paying for AI today going to be something that's going to be sustainable, or does the overall macro of what's going on in the industry look like it's going to change what the economics look like? And if it does, how do you go about getting a handle on that? What's it going to look like in terms of what you do on a day-to-day basis versus what your business does and so forth? So we're going to dig into that right after the break. Today's show is sponsored by ShareGate. You're out of time. Copilot needs to be deployed ASAP, but your tenant really isn't ready for it. Years of data, permissions, and users lurk in its shadows, ready to be exposed by AI. ShareGate Protect sees it all, so you can find the exposure risks, fix them fast, and deploy AI with confidence. Microsoft 365 Governance, they've got this. Learn more at sharegate.com/protect. Today's show is sponsored by Nasuni. There's a growing gap in AI right now between what's possible in theory and what successfully works at scale inside an enterprise. The difference comes down to unstructured file data. Many AI initiatives struggle because the file data they depend on is scattered, unstructured, and disconnected from where and how work actually happens. Nasuni changes that. It brings your unstructured file data into a single, secure foundation so AI, both generative and agentic, can access it with the context, governance, and performance it needs in production. Bring AI to where your unstructured data lives. See what it takes to activate your data for AI and request a demo at nasuni.com/AI. We're back, and I want to dig into this thesis that I sort of mentioned and hinted on at the top of the show, which is this idea that, up until now, and maybe over the last 2.5, 3 years, the price that we've been paying for AI has been somewhat subsidized, maybe highly subsidized. And it may not necessarily be a great prognosticator of what AI is going to cost in the future. Now, I feel like it's an interesting question, especially if we look at it from an enterprise perspective, because on one hand, we have always seen over time a certain amount of things happen as new things come along. Typically, the technology, to a certain extent, becomes cheaper. Just as, it's kind of the classic volume play as we see more and more people adopting the internet, or more and more people adopting iPhones, or adopting, cloud computing, whatever it might be. Because of that volume, the people that are providing that are able to, due to economies of scale, able to drive the price down. And, while over time, our volume of usage goes up, hence maybe our total spend goes up, right? Over time in the past, we've already seen, sort of the price of things come down. Now, the challenge of that is, it feels like, and I want to kind of dive into this, the economics around AI are somewhat different than we've seen in the past, right? I mean, right now we have a couple of things. Number one, we are building fundamentally, AI on the most expensive technology we've ever seen before. Not only the ability to collect the data, to train the data is incredibly expensive with incredibly high cost resources to go about doing that, i.e. data scientists and so forth. We're building that upon the most expensive factories to go about doing this, right? They are extremely expensive. They are very difficult to build. They are, running into both economic and political challenges of going about doing this. They have to be cooled in a different way. They need energy in a different way at a volume that is different than we've ever seen before. And then they run on top of the most expensive computing unit that we've ever seen before, right? And, and again, some of this is, well, that's just what happens when you have new technologies, right? We just haven't reached volume yet. We haven't really thought about things like efficiency. We've really thought about, up to this point, just like, what can it do, right? You go and you're really kind of focused upon like what's possible with this technology, not how do we optimize this technology. And so, again, there's fairness in saying, well, what we have today might not be what it looks like in the future. But what I want to do is really kind of explore what that might look like. Because I think if, for example, you are an enterprise CIO, or you are a SVP of some line of business that's going to embed AI in what you do, if you're building it around this idea of, hey, we are paying $20 a month per license, or $30 per seat, or whatever we do, and then you're going to build a fundamental business model around that, I think there may be some inherent flaws in that thinking that are worth exploring. If for no other reason such that you don't get to a point a year from now, a year and a half from now, 2 years from now, in which you've embraced the technology, you've figured out the technology, and the economics around it don't go in a negative direction, which is what you were expecting, and they instead go in a maybe upward direction, or a significant upward direction. So let's take a look at that. And so I kind of was looking at this from a couple of different angles, and I'll kind of dig into this. And again, this is part of these sort of like 10 big questions I think every enterprise CIO should be really kind of exploring. So I think there is evidence that sort of this first phase that we've seen of generative AI, and again, at some point in time, like we sort of mark everything from when ChatGPT came along, but we've seen some other things that are worth throwing out, right? Just in terms of timing and understanding stuff. It's sort of the equivalent of us joking around a lot that, hey, is cloud still in the first inning, right? The analogy that Andy Jassy always used to make, and then 10 years in or 15 years in, we're like, hey, are we still in the first inning? I think several people, Ben Thompson and others, have sort of talked about this idea that we've really already had kind of 3 phases with generative AI. We just haven't necessarily seen 3 economic phases, but we've seen 3 technology phases, right? Sort of the first phase was the wide adoption, or the wide availability of generative AI, right? So we saw that with ChatGPT. We then saw some follow-up with open source models being available to the world and so forth. And so that was sort of the first one. That was the one that you said, oh, wow, this is really interesting technology. I should go explore it. The second sort of phase was, we saw reasoning models come along, and then we saw, so things like OpenAI's O1 started to have a reasoning model. So the idea of these models can be given prompts, or they can inherently sort of think longer about things. How much you see of that thinking may or may not always be visible, but you're able to now use this for much more complex, much more linked together types of inquiries and sort of workflows and types of work, right? So we went from availability of just big, large language models to reasoning models. And then obviously, we started to see, some amount of economic variation with things like DeepSeek came along and was building these reasoning models that had been, distilled from other models at lower price points, right? So we started to see, okay, there's some changing of economics, there's some competition in the market. That's interesting. Maybe that's going to become the tipping point for this, right? And then we began to see the spread of agents and it's sort of agentic workflows. And what this really brought to bear, because agentic workflows are kind of built upon the fundamental of reasoning models, right? The idea that I can now have something that can sort of think, that can start to connect together multiple types of workflows, can go off and call tools that are outside of the model. And so reasoning kind of became the baseline for what became agentic. And what that becomes sort of interesting and a tipping point that's worth sort of digging into is, while we have seen, looking at just the numbers at which pricing is put out in the marketplace, hey, how much can I rent a GPU for, or, at this, level of 1 million tokens input or output or something like that. We're seeing generally that the price of inference has been coming down somewhere between, say, 75 and 90% a year in terms of cost. We've also seen the amount of traffic, the amount of tokens that are required to go from a sort of chatbot sort of interface to an agentic type of interface grow at an even higher level, right? In some cases, 500%. 1,000%, some orders of magnitude growth, right? And so what we're now starting to see is this idea of, inference costs are coming down, let's call them, 75, 80% year over year, but we're seeing the volume of traffic, the number of tokens, both inbound and outbound, plus tokens that are being used to think through and reason and so forth, growing 500%, 1,000%, right? And so what that would sort of imply is, we're going to start to see a different set of economics start to come into play, right? So there was a set of economics that set that first $20 a month frontier model access, a ChatGPT account, a Claude account. We've started to see, more and more tiers of that, because that is a recognition by the market that, more and more usage is happening and people are getting value out of that. So as you're using more and more, I should charge you accordingly, right? That's not unusual. We've always seen certain levels of that. But it does start to bring in the idea that, the first number of them were subsidized to a certain extent. Maybe it was a good thing, maybe it was a bad thing, that the first, sort of experience that everybody had was that $20 thing for ChatGPT. You were asking it everything from, I've got things that I would talk to a therapist about, to, look at stock market pricing, to, whatever the heck you were trying to get out of it. We've obviously seen value start to be identified through, the pricing models that we're seeing from things like Claude, and we're seeing a rapid step up of what they are charging to, on a monthly basis, from $20 to $100 to, several orders of magnitude more than that. And so it's sort of, and then obviously we're seeing, we're starting to see them have a need for more and more compute. And we're seeing some instances here and there in which that compute is being throttled because, most likely they're having certain amounts of shortages, or they're having, over demand of the capabilities they have, right? So it does sort of lend itself towards this idea that it's very likely that we're going to be seeing price increases within the AI that you use. And we've not only seen that, but we've also seen some changes in how people think about the pricing, right? So, and what I mean by people, I mean the people that are delivering the AI services, so the token providers, if you will. And so what have we seen? We've seen some pricing increases happen, right? In terms of, from everything from Anthropic starting to hint around that, like maybe that $20 a month one is going away. Maybe the caps on that $20 to $100 one is going away. We've seen Microsoft as a good example of this, and we've seen this with a number of SaaS providers starting to say, well, it's going to be that $30 a seat price, sort of premium, but then we're going to now start charging above and beyond that some way for either usage or outcomes, right? And so we're already beginning to see kind of this tiering from free tier to sort of subscription tier to usage tier, usage being kind of a difficult thing to define, to this idea of like outcome tiers, right? Which again, outcomes sort of difficult to define depending on what you're trying to do. But we're already starting to see this idea of, the largest AI providers, the largest AI token providers, whether those are hyperscalers or the frontier model labs or the neoclouds or whatever they are, don't have enough compute to necessarily keep up with the demand, which is inherently sort of probably a good thing for, hey, this market is active and people are seeing value out of it, at least at the price point that they're seeing it right now. But in order for these companies to pay back the money they owe, get the return on investment that they want, whether that is the largest hyperscalers literally spending all of their free cash flow to the frontier labs taking on, massive amounts of private equity investment or debt investment, or, sovereign wealth funds getting involved, right? We've got sort of pressures that are saying, hey, there is growing demand, hence, and limited supply, hence, basic economics 101. We're going to see some price increases. This next thing that we're starting to see is the kind of the hidden economics and the frontier labs sort of shifting their focus. And what this means is sort of two things. Number one is, a lot of what you don't see, and I think if you asked the majority of people that are doing stuff with, more advanced types of things, so they're beginning to understand agents. And we've talked about this, Brandon Wichert and I have talked about this, the people that are beginning to use the technology more frequently as a regular day-to-day thing, they're quickly becoming sort of super users. And I don't mean like they're getting super results, but they're becoming sort of super users. They're learning how to use the technology. They're learning how to be more intelligent with how they deploy it. But that intelligence is not usually in the form of like, how do I be more efficient with this? But they're figuring out ways to ask it better questions, better prompts, to do more parallel tasks and activities. And ultimately, more and more, you're seeing those folks talk about, hey, and I've run into these problems as well. Sorry, you're done for the day, right? Oh, it's such and such time of day. Your token limit has hit. Do you want to buy more, or do you want to wait until a point in time later in the day or till tomorrow to do that? So we're seeing more of that. I think if you ask most of those people, like, hey, how many tokens did you use? Do you understand how much you're using? Do you understand how much that kind of prompt or query was? They kind of don't really have any idea, right? And again, because a lot of this is there are so many tokens that are being chewed up within these new reasoning models. Oftentimes people don't necessarily know which model to pick, right? They're given some choices. Maybe they're not completely obvious to them, like best, fastest, cheapest. It's sort of like, oh, should I pick Opus or should I pick Sonnet or to pick, and that's not obvious to people. Like, where's the efficiency there, right? Where are you going to get the most bang for the buck? And then obviously we're seeing, as some of these behaviors are starting to happen, at least again for that leading edge of people, that the frontier labs are starting to shift their focus, right? They're shifting from just purely kind of land grab and these ideas of like, hey, our model's the fastest, to much more value-oriented types of things, right? Whether it is memory capabilities, connectors into other systems, MCP capabilities, agents. And so there's a recognition for them that, hey, these folks who are my biggest users, again, normal sort of distribution economics, they're looking to try and get as much value from them as possible, because these folks, they're starting to understand what they do. So what does all this mean? If you're an enterprise, if you're a CIO, if you're an SVP building a product that's going to be embedded with AI, what are the things that you should sort of take away from this? I think what we're going to see is a couple of things happening. Number one, I think the first question you're going to start to ask yourself is, do I really have a handle on what we're doing with AI, right? And so what I mean by that is, while we're starting to see more and more things go into production, I think that we're still very much in the, hey, did this solve a problem for me? And do we really kind of understand, what solving that problem means in terms of the change for our business? And so, your focus is very much upon outcomes and not accountability, right? It's on outcomes and not sort of the accounting for it, right? And this is very much what we saw with the early days of cloud, right? It was all about kind of the cloud promising us that forever the prices were going to get cheaper. I hasn't necessarily said that. Like there's some folks talking about it, but Andy Jassy always used to say, hey, look, the price of S3 has gone down, the price of EC2 has gone down. And so there was a sort of an inherent kind of promise there that, hey, this was going to happen forever. So the more that you are bringing ideas, experimenting, trying to figure out if they're going to help your business, you're going to be able to do that at continuing lower cost. Now, I don't know that the same economics or the same concept can apply to AI. And again, a lot of that is because right now the technology is still incredibly expensive. Now, we would assume that's going to come down. But more and more so, we're seeing from, model, at least from the frontier model providers, the token providers, that their business model is built upon, not efficiency for you, but upon usage for you, right? And so we're going to see commodity inference get cheaper, but we're going to see the frontier reasoning remain at a premium, right? And again, a lot of this is, the psychology of, we want you to stay very attached to this thing, which we've seen throughout every internet technology, but because they have such financial burdens to sort of get through, right? And so they're looking for that. So that it's sort of the first piece of this in terms of sort of forecasting where that's going is, at what point do you start to ask yourself, should I be fully a token consumer, or do I start to become a token provider, right? And that's a little bit of a challenging question because, again, now you're starting to look at, sort of CAPEX math versus OPEX math. I do want to point out that we did put together a sort of OPEX versus CAPEX or token provider versus token consumer calculator, something that's fairly simple. It could get you started. If you go to the enterpriseaishow.com and look at the top menu over to the right, you'll see AI calculator. It lets you go in and put some things in. It lets you pick the models. There are lots of different models you can pick from. Lets you pick the number of users that you might be engaged with, or the different volume of traffic that you have. And it lets you sort of compare, hey, what would it look like if I was a token consumer versus a token provider? And so we put that out there for you. We'll continue to try and build some better tools, some more advanced tools, but that pulls data from Hugging Face. All of the data that's behind that is sort of publicly available information. And you can put in a bunch of different things in there in terms of the GPUs that you use, how long you do it for. So take a look at that. So that becomes sort of the first thing I think that we get into is, should you at any point in time start considering whether you should be entirely a token consumer, and do I truly understand the economics that are going to happen with that, whether my use cases are going to be more commodity type of use cases versus a little more reasoning, more premium types of use cases. But then I think what we're going to see once we get past that sort of first phase of this is, and again, this might be 12 months from now, maybe 24 months from now, is we're going to see a much, much more complex set of billing that's going to come into play, right? And what I mean by that is, if we think about what were, the different types of sort of billing or economics that could be in play, if you are entirely a token consumer, token provider, right? So you're providing local or open source models. Over time, if you're utilizing your GPUs well, you're going to see near sort of free marginal cost, right? That again, the sort of build versus buy. We're going to see from a commodity cloud perspective, rather so you're just doing chatbot type of stuff and kind of text-based things. You're going to see utility pricing, right? We're going to see pricing kind of normalize over time. The different providers will all sort of watch each other. Nobody's probably going to significantly undercut each other until they have some significantly different amount of capacity, which most of them don't have today. Looking at the big 5, 6, 7 providers, they don't have excess capacity. So we're going to see some level of utility happening. We will start to see premium pricing or platform premium happen around enterprise orchestration. So as you start figuring out, okay, we did 10, 20, 100, 1,000, 10,000 agents. How do I go about orchestrating that? Meaning, how do I make sure that they well covered by the harness that we have available to them, by the security we have, the guardrails that we have, you're tracking certain amounts of usage. There's going to be a premium that you'll pay for that at sort of a platform level or a substrate level. And then we're going to start to get into really premium pricing for accessing those reasoning models, right? So you're going to have to start figuring out how much of your workloads will, really, really require access to frontier models, right? Versus how much are you able to do with sort of lower size or potentially lower quality models. I think the quality level is still going to remain fairly high. We've seen that with open source models. But what are the things that truly require frontier level reasoning or whatever comes next? I'm willing to pay a premium for that, although I need to figure out what the actual premium is. And then it starts to get really interesting, because if we sort of do that same sort of thing around autonomous work, around agentic work, and again, that agentic work is 5x, 10x the amount of volume. Now you're going to really ask yourself, okay, how do I measure that, right? Do I want to know how long the thing was thinking for? Do I really want 100-page documents coming out, like strategy things or so forth? Or am I really looking at outcome-based pricing? And this is again where you start to think about how complicated something like AWS pricing became over time. You were being measured for, the time usage of the service, the amount of data for the service, the inbound traffic, the egress traffic, how often you were talking to other services, just a handful of different things that, made things like AWS pricing very complicated because you were dealing with premiums, primitives that all had different things. What we're going to be dealing with from an AI perspective is sort of a similar type of thing. A certain amount of things for outcome-based pricing, premium for tokens, platform level pricing for things like security and governance, utility pricing for tokens, of which most people couldn't tell you, hey, if I did these 10 tasks, how many tokens did I take? So it's going to get complicated, right? And this is where, again, the build versus buy piece is really going to kind of come into play. And you're going to start asking yourself, maybe earlier than later, can I deal with that level of complexity? Do I understand where I need build versus buy? Do I know where I need premium versus non-premium? And so I think those are all going to become, very big factors in this. It's just a matter of the timing of it, right? So you think about those things, you kind of put those things all together, and then you get out a little bit further and you start to think about, okay, how much of that shift continues to stay independent? Because right now, I think if you ask most companies, while they have groups that are doing things or trying to do things somewhat centrally, AI right now is very much in that phase of sort of shadow, right? You've got independent people that are doing really amazing things. You might have groups that are doing some stuff. Maybe you're starting to centralize some things. Maybe you're doing stuff through a Bedrock or a Vertex or a Frontier, or you're starting to build some self-service on-prem. But you haven't really figured out the muscles yet for going, hey, how do we get these 5 or 6 people that have really figured this out to train the other 500 people or the next 1,000 people, right? I think we haven't really seen that yet. And once we start doing those things, it's one thing to sort of say, hey, I've got a couple superstars, I'll let them, run with the credit card and kind of see where it goes. What you got to figure out is like, do I want all of their best practices to spread to my other 500 people? Maybe you do, right? Maybe because maybe you're realizing that like those 10 people really are doing the work of 50 people. And if you could get 500 people to be doing that, they'd be doing the work of 5,000 people. Maybe that's where you want to go. But we don't really have those, those mechanisms in place. And we're going to dig into that in a later show of like, how do we go about kind of sharing best practices, establishing best practices? When does it make sense to sort of centralize certain capabilities like prompt sharing or guardrails or kind of building around certain harnesses? And when does it make sense to allow sort of the distributed nature of that happening? But those sorts of decisions are also going to have decisions and impacts upon, future pricing in the future as things move on. So anyways, I think if I were, kind of summarizing all this stuff up and kind of, thinking about it, I think first and foremost, we are probably still very much in a subsidized AI era right now, right? So the things that you're building, if you're building your AI sort of calculations, what it's going to cost, where you think it's probably going to be, you may want to have a certain eye upon, hey, what have we seen in the past when things were subsidized versus when adoption really happened or when consolidation of the market happened, what happened to pricing? And maybe Uber is a good example to take a look at, right? Like Uber pricing, Lyft pricing, ride sharing pricing was all pretty subsidized for a while. It was kind of a land grab. And then at points in times where we saw things like Lyft fall off or other things, regulation happen, Uber was able to raise their pricing significantly. So that might be a good sort of reference as to where we are. The subsidy era is probably coming to a close, or at least beginning to see that, right? We're seeing premium tiers, we're seeing metered pricing, we're seeing people like OpenAI is already starting to do stuff like, enterprise future pricing plans and so forth. So that we're beginning to see what that next era is starting to look like. I think people are going to be somewhat surprised at what the next, price point they're going to be paying for it. But again, the surprise may be in the same way that if somebody said, hey, a cup of coffee is $5 versus now it's $13, that seems like a lot. It really kind of boils down to, how much value do you get out of it? So if somebody said, hey, all of a sudden, everybody that was paying $30 a month is now paying $150 a month, you may think that's, incredibly high, right? Oh, it's 5x what it was before. But if you are able to then measure, hey, how much value did I get out of it? How much value am I creating, or how much time am I saving, or how much multiplicity am I getting out of my workers? Then maybe the numbers make sense, right? But I think that era of subsidy is very quickly coming to an end. We're seeing that across SaaS. We're seeing that across a number of things. So you got to kind of start planning for that stuff. I think the third piece to kind of remember from a summary perspective, that AI agents are going to look fundamentally different than what your human interaction is with AI. Once we start to get to a point where we're unleashing sort of swarms of agents to go on and work on tasks, we're going to work on things from an autonomous perspective, and you're going to have autonomous workflows. Those are going to have, 5x, 10x, maybe 20x the amount of volume, in terms of token consumption that you're seeing from sort of human interaction. So if you're not planning around that and you're seeing your subsidies going away, so your pricing's going up, your equation as a whole is probably going to change considerably. Fourth thing is, I think people are going to have to start understanding sort of the idea of, what do I get value out of AI when it's a commodity versus when do I require sort of frontier level capabilities, and being able to separate those where they make sense. All right. Right now, it's very easy to just kind of go, well, I can get everything from the frontier clouds or from the frontier providers. The question will become, but can I afford that? Right. And there will be companies and there will be individuals that can afford that. But, if we look at things from any sort of historical sense, we've always had a certain amount of tiering of sort of, super premium, ultra premium, and then mass adoption. And, I think AI is eventually going to fall into that, as we've seen with every other historical trend. And then finally, I think the question really becomes, how do we start to price these sort of moving up the stack that we're starting to see more and more conversation about, whether it is orchestration of agents, whether it is governance of the experience that you have of delivering AI to your customers, so whether that's guardrails or security, whether that's understanding the value of workflows, both from what do humans deliver, what do agents deliver, but also, what does a workflow cost me? And then, what does sort of the enterprise context, the operational tooling really start to look like? And that may end up being a very, very small percentage. Being able to provide governance and being able to provide self-service might provide a very, very small cost to the system, but it may also provide you the right kind of framework to be able to grow your business accordingly. So, I think the last thing I sort of think about is the big AI question may no longer be like which model's smartest, but how well do you understand what the economics look like across your portfolio? And you may not get to that problem right away because you may still be solving your first 3, 4, 5 problems that AI is sort of centric to what that is. But as you move from those early initial ones into more mass adoption across your company, across a set of workloads, understanding that broad mix of what the economics are going to look like, whether it is token consumer versus token provider, whether it is commodity pricing versus premium pricing, and how much percentage what that looks like for you. And then ultimately, how well are you kind of predicting when these potential, increases in pricing are coming? Because we've already begun to see those. You expect those are going to happen. How well does your timing work for that? And how well does your makeup work for that? So anyways, with that, I'm going to wrap it up. Hopefully this was sort of interesting. I feel like it's valuable enough for us to talk about some of these big picture questions. I think it's going to spur a lot more conversation amongst people. Hopefully it will spur people kind of coming forward and wanting to talk about their stories. We'd love to sort of hear as people are figuring out their AI economics or token economics. We'd love to sort of hear that and highlight that on the show. And you'll see us producing more content, whether it again is that beginning calculator, go take a look at that, or some content around how to go about framing this for your enterprise. So we're going to begin doing that throughout this month and throughout the rest of the year. So hopefully this was interesting to you. If it was, please share with a friend. Please tell a friend. If you get a chance, as we've moved to this sort of rebranding for the Enterprise AI show from the Cloudcast, if you can go out to whether it's Spotify or YouTube or Apple Podcast or wherever you get your podcast, give us a review. We'd really appreciate that. It helps us grow the podcast. It helps raise awareness, especially as the AI market is very, very crowded at this point. So thank you for your time, and we will talk to you next week.
Thanks for listening. Check us out at theenterpriseaishow.com for past shows, newsletters, and all things enterprise AI.